If you had walked through the twisting, narrow alleys of London in the spring of 1720, you would have felt a vibration in the cobblestones that had nothing to do with horses or carriages. It was the frantic heartbeat of a city that had lost its mind. In a small labyrinth of streets known as Exchange Alley, centered around a smoky, chaotic establishment called Garraway's Coffee House, thousands of people were packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, roasted coffee beans, and tobacco smoke, but the most overpowering scent was greed. They were not there to discuss philosophy or politics or the recent wars. They were there to buy a piece of paper that they believed was a magical ticket to infinite wealth. Dukes stood next to dustmen. Ladies in fine silk dresses stood next to fishmongers, wiping their hands on dirty aprons. They were all shouting the same name until their throats were raw. South Sea. Among this chaotic crowd, there was one man who stood out not because of his shouting, but because of his silence. He was a man of immense dignity, with a face that was known across the civilized world, a face that had stared out from portraits in the great universities of Europe. He was the president of the Royal Society. He was the master of the Royal Mint. He was the man who had decoded the laws of gravity and the motion of the planets, Sir Isaac Newton. He stood there watching the madness with a calculating eye. He had spent his entire life bringing order to the universe, explaining the chaos of nature with elegant mathematical formulas. He believed that everything followed a logical pattern. He believed that cause led to effect. He believed that the world was rational and predictable if you only had the right equations. He was about to learn the most painful lesson of his life. He was about to learn that you can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies to the fraction of a degree, but you cannot calculate the madness of people. This is the story of how the smartest man who ever lived lost his fortune in the stupidest financial scam in history. It is a story of greed, corruption, and a delusion so powerful it nearly destroyed the British government and toppled the monarchy. To understand the South Sea bubble, we have to understand the desperate world that created it. Britain, in the early 18th century, was not the stable imperial power we imagine today. It was a nation teetering on the edge of financial ruin. For decades, Britain had been locked in expensive, exhausting wars against France, particularly the War of the Spanish Succession. Wars cost money. They require ships and soldiers and gunpowder and uniforms. The government had borrowed millions of pounds to pay for these conflicts. By 1719, the national debt had reached a staggering £50 million. In those days, that was an astronomical sum, a number so large it was difficult for the human mind to comprehend. The interest payments alone were eating up half the tax revenue of the country. The government was trapped. They could not raise taxes any higher without causing a revolution among the peasantry and the merchants. They could not default on the debt because then no one would ever lend to them again, and the nation would be defenseless against foreign invasion. They needed a miracle. And just when they were most desperate, a group of slick businessmen walked into the treasury with a solution that sounded too good to be true. The leader of this group was a man named John Blunt. Blunt was not a gentleman. He was not an aristocrat. He was a scrivener, a man who wrote contracts for a living. He was the son of a shoemaker, born into a strict religious Baptist family, but he had abandoned piety for profit. He was sharp, aggressive, and morally flexible. He was a man who understood the dark arts of finance better than anyone in London. He had cut his teeth running a company called the Sword Blade Company, which had a reputation for shady dealings in land speculation. He looked at the massive national debt, and he did not see a problem. He saw an opportunity to become the richest man in the world. Blunt proposed a scheme that was breathtaking in its audacity. He suggested that his new company, the South Sea Company, would take over the national debt. The company would issue shares to the public. The people who owned government bonds, the debt of the nation, would exchange those guaranteed bonds for shares in the South Sea Company. In return, the government would pay the company a lower interest rate, saving the treasury millions. But why would a bondholder give up a guaranteed government payout for a risky stock? Because the government would give the company a monopoly on trade with the Spanish colonies in South America. It sounded perfect. The government would get rid of its debt. The bondholders would get shares in an exciting new trading company that promised unlimited growth. And the company would get rich trading gold and spices and silver from the New World. Everyone would win. It was the first great privatization scheme in history. There was just one small problem. A problem that John Blunt knew about but decided to ignore. The South Sea Company did not actually have any trade. The trade monopoly was a lie. South America was owned by Spain. Britain and Spain were historic enemies who had been killing each other on the high seas for 100 years. The King of Spain was not about to let British ships sail into his ports and take his gold. The only trade right Britain actually secured was something called the asiento. It was a contract to supply enslaved people to the Spanish colonies. It was a brutal and grim business involving human misery on a massive scale, but even that was strictly limited. The Spanish only allowed one British ship per year to dock in their ports. One ship. One ship a year laden with goods could not generate enough profit to pay off 50 million pounds of debt. It could not generate enough profit to justify a stock price of 100 pounds, let alone 1,000. The entire business model of the South Sea Company was a fiction. It was a shell company with a fancy name and a government charter. It was a vampire, sucking the life out of the British economy while pretending to be its savior. But John Blunt was not selling reality. He was selling a dream. He was selling the mystery of the South Seas. He knew that the British public knew nothing about South America. To them it was a mythical land of infinite riches, where the streets were paved with gold and the rivers flowed with silver and the natives wore emeralds the size of apples. Blunt launched a propaganda campaign that would make modern marketing executives blush. He spread rumors of secret treaties with Spain that did not exist. He paid journalists to write stories about ships laden with treasure that were just over the horizon waiting to dock in London. He bribed members of Parliament to speak in favor of the scheme, giving them free shares that they could sell back to the company for a profit. And it worked. The initial public offering of South Sea stock was a sensation. The shares started at £100. Within weeks, they were rising. And this is where Sir Isaac Newton enters the story. Newton was a wealthy man. He had saved his money frugally from his university position at Cambridge and his lucrative job as Master of the Mint. He was a prudent investor who understood the value of hard currency. But he was also a man who liked to be right. He looked at the South Sea Company and he analyzed the numbers. He saw the potential for a quick profit. He invested a portion of his savings early in the game. The stock went up. Newton watched his money grow. He felt the warm glow of success. He had made a calculated risk, and it had paid off. Being a rational man, he decided to cash out. He sold his shares and pocketed a profit of £7,000. In 1720, £7,000 was a fortune. It was enough to build a manor house or buy a carriage and horses and live in luxury for the rest of his life. Newton felt brilliant. He had beaten the market. He had ridden the wave and jumped off before it crashed. He told his niece that he was satisfied, but the wave did not crash. It got bigger. This is the psychological torture of a bubble. It is not just about greed. It is about envy. After Newton sold his shares, the stock price of the South Sea Company did not stop. It accelerated. It went from £200 to 300, then 300 to 400. It defied all logic. There was no news of successful voyages. There were no dividends paid from profits. It was rising simply because people believed it would rise. Newton sat in his study surrounded by his books and his telescopes and watched the numbers climb. But worse than the numbers were the people. He saw his friends' people he considered intellectually inferior becoming fabulously rich. He saw maids quitting their jobs because they had made a fortune trading shares. He saw idiots who couldn't solve a simple equation buying country estates. He saw the carriages of the new rich clogging the streets of London, splashing mud on the clothes of the prudent. The sensation of missing out began to gnaw at him. It is a feeling that overrides intellect. It whispers in your ear that you're missing the opportunity of a lifetime. It tells you that the old rules no longer apply. It tells you that this time is different. It tells you that you are the fool for standing on the sidelines while everyone else is at the party. By June of 1720, the stock price hit £700. The hysteria in London was total. The streets around Exchange Alley were so crowded that carriages could not pass. The coffee houses were so full that business was conducted on the pavement. People were buying shares on credit. They were buying shares with money they needed for food. Ladies sold their jewelry to buy stock. Clergymen used the church collection plate money to speculate. John Blunt fueled the fire. He offered new subscriptions of stock with low down payments. You only had to put 10% down and you could pay the rest later. It was leverage. It allowed people with small amounts of money to control huge amounts of stock. It was the same financial drug that caused the crash of 1929 and the crisis of 2008. Blunt was printing money out of thin air and the people loved him for it. He was knighted by the king. He was treated like a national hero. Newton watched the price hit 800. He couldn't take it anymore. The rational part of his brain, the part that understood gravity and calculus, shut down. The emotional part, the primate brain that wants to belong to the herd, took over. Sir Isaac Newton re-entered the market. But this time, he didn't just invest a little. He went all in. He took his initial capital, he took the £7,000 of profit he had made earlier, and he added the rest of his life savings. He liquidated his government bonds. He scraped together every penny he could find. He bought shares at the absolute peak of the market. He bought in when the price was nearly £1,000 a share. He was not alone. The entire British establishment was in the market. The king himself, George I, was a governor of the company. His mistresses were given shares as gifts. Members of Parliament were bribed with stock options. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was deeply involved. It was a state-sponsored pyramid scheme. The royal family bought, the politicians bought, the poets bought. Alexander Pope, the great writer, put his money in. Sir Godfrey Kneller, the famous painter, put his money in. For a few glorious weeks in the summer of 1720, it seemed like everyone in Britain was rich. The luxury shops were sold out of silk and velvet. The theaters were full every night. There was a sense of euphoria. The South Sea Company was the greatest engine of wealth ever created. It seemed as if John Blunt had discovered the philosopher's stone turning paper into gold. But bubbles are fragile things. They depend on confidence. They depend on the belief that there is always someone dumber than you who will buy your shares for a higher price. This is called the greater fool theory. But eventually you run out of fools. Eventually the music stops and there are no chairs left. The first crack in the illusion came from an unexpected place. The success of the South Sea Company had inspired hundreds of imitators. If John Blunt could get rich selling a dream, why couldn't others? A wave of new companies launched in Exchange Alley. These were known as the bubble companies. Some of them were legitimate insurance schemes or building projects, but most were absurd. There was a company formed for the purpose of trading in hair. There was a company formed for the transmuting of quicksilver into a malleable fine metal. There was a company for importing walnut trees from Virginia. There was famously a company formed for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. And people invested in them. They threw money at anything with a prospectus. John Blunt looked at these competitor bubbles, and he got angry. He felt they were sucking capital away from the South Sea Company. He wanted all the money for himself. He was a monopolist at heart. So he lobbied the government to pass a law. It was called the Bubble Act. This law forbade the formation of any joint stock company without a royal charter. Blunt thought the Bubble Act would destroy his competition and drive everyone back to South Sea stock. He was right. The Bubble Act popped the smaller bubbles. The hair trading company and the transmutation company collapsed overnight. Investors in those companies lost everything. But Blunt had made a fatal miscalculation. When those investors lost their money in the small bubbles, they needed cash to pay their debts. They had bought on margin, and now the banks were calling in the loans. They had to sell their only remaining asset to cover their losses. And their only remaining asset was South Sea stock. The selling started slowly at first, a few merchants liquidating their positions to pay bills. But then the price dipped. 900, 850. Fear is a contagion. It spreads faster than greed. When people saw the price drop, they started to wonder. They started to look at the fundamentals. They started to ask the questions they should have asked months ago. Where are the ships? Where's the trade? Where are the profits? The answer came back from the docks. There were no ships. There was no trade. There were no profits. The realization hit London like a physical blow. The psychology shifted instantly. The crowd in Exchange Alley changed from a mob of greedy buyers into a mob of terrified sellers. Everyone wanted out at the same time. But in a market crash, when everyone wants to sell, there are no buyers. The liquidity evaporated. The price plummeted. 800, 700, 600. Newton watched in horror. His fortune was melting away before his eyes. He was trapped. If he sold now, he would accept a massive loss. His pride told him to hold on. He told himself it was just a correction. He told himself the king wouldn't let it fail. He told himself that he was Isaac Newton and he didn't make mistakes like this. He told himself that the government would intervene. But the laws of financial gravity are just as ruthless as the laws of physical gravity. What goes up must come down. And the South Sea stock was falling from the stratosphere. As the summer turned to autumn, the price crashed below 400, then 300. The wealth of the nation had vanished. It had been transferred from the pockets of the gullible public into the pockets of the few insiders who had sold early. But Newton was not an insider. He was just a brilliant man who had been played for a fool. As we end the first part of this story, Sir Isaac Newton is standing in the ruins of his fortune. The smartest man in the world has been humbled by his own emotions. But the story is not over. The crash of the South Sea Company was not just a financial disaster, it was a political earthquake. The people demanded justice, they demanded blood. They wanted to know who had stolen their money. And as the investigation began, the trail of corruption led all the way to the throne itself. In the second part, we will see the chaotic aftermath, the cover-up, and the rise of the man who would clean up the mess and invent the modern office of the Prime Minister. We will see how Newton lived with his failure and the final bitter lesson he left for posterity. The autumn of 1720 was the bleakest season London had ever known. The fog that rolled off the Thames seemed thicker and colder than usual, wrapping the city in a shroud of gloom that matched the despair of its citizens. The South Sea stock, which had touched the heavens at £1,000, had crashed back down to earth, settling at a miserable £130. The wealth of the nation had not just decreased, it had evaporated. It was as if a great fire had swept through the ledger books of the city, burning inheritances, dowries, pensions, and savings. The suicide rate in London spiked. The Thames River became the final resting place for ruined merchants who could not face their creditors. Aristocrats who had mortgaged their estates to buy stock found themselves homeless, their ancestral lands sold off to pay for a dream that never existed. The clerk, who had dreamed of retiring to a country villa, went back to his desk for another 40 years of drudgery. The social fabric of Britain was tearing apart. There were reports of riots in the streets. People attacked the carriages of the rich, assuming that anyone with money must have been part of the scam. But amidst the sorrow, there was a burning white-hot rage. The British people realized they had not just been unlucky, they had been robbed. The South Sea Company was not a failed business, it was a criminal conspiracy. The directors had sold their own shares while telling the public to buy. They had lent money to themselves to buy stock to inflate the price. They had cooked the books. They had bribed the government to keep the scheme going. Mobs gathered outside the Houses of Parliament. They shouted for the directors to be sewn into sacks with snakes and thrown into the river in ancient Roman punishment for parricide. They demanded heads. They demanded vengeance. The mood was revolutionary. The monarchy itself was in danger. King George I was deeply implicated. He had been a governor of the company. His German mistresses, who were already unpopular for being foreign, were known to have made thousands of pounds from the scheme. If the full truth came out, the Hanoverian dynasty might fall and the Stuarts might return. In this atmosphere of crisis, the government turned to the only man who could save them, Robert Walpole. Walpole was a politician of immense skill and zero sentimentality. He was a stout man with a coarse manner, but a brilliant political mind. He knew the price of every vote and every conscience. He had opposed the South Sea scheme in the beginning, but he had also made a tidy profit from it, quietly selling at the top, while publicly warning against it. He was the ultimate pragmatist. He was known as the Screenmaster General because he was an expert at screening the powerful from the consequences of their actions. Walpole stepped in to manage the disaster. His goal was not justice. His goal was stability. He knew that if the king was dragged into a trial, the country could collapse into civil war. So he orchestrated a masterclass in political cover-ups. He allowed a parliamentary inquiry, but he carefully controlled its scope. He threw the directors of the company to the wolves. John Blunt, the architect of the scheme, was stripped of his fortune. He was allowed to keep only a small pittance and was banned from ever sitting in Parliament, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. John Aislaby was found guilty of corruption and thrown into the Tower of London. The Postmaster General James Craggs died mysteriously before he could testify, rumored to have taken poison to avoid the shame of a trial. The treasurer of the company, a man named Robert Knight, who held the secret book of bribes, fled the country. He took a boat to Calais and disappeared into Europe, carrying the secrets that could have brought down the government. It was widely suspected that Walpole had allowed him to escape to ensure his silence. But while the secondary figures were punished, the big fish were protected. Walpole ensured that the evidence linking the king and his mistresses to the fraud was suppressed. He saved the monarchy by sacrificing the minions. In doing so, he consolidated his own power. He became the indispensable man. He became effectively the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, ruling the country for the next 20 years. The South Sea Bubble created the modern British political system. But for Sir Isaac Newton, there was no political rescue. There was no bailout. He was left to survey the wreckage of his personal finances. Newton had lost £20,000. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in London at that time might earn £20 a year. A gentleman could live comfortably on £200 a year. Newton had lost 1,000 years of wages. In modern terms, he had lost millions of dollars. The bulk of his liquid wealth was gone. The psychological impact on Newton was profound. This was a man who was used to being the master of his domain. In the world of physics, he was a god. When he looked at a beam of light, he could break it down into the spectrum. When he looked at the moon, he could explain the tides. He was the man who brought logic to the universe. He was the man who had written the Principia Mathematica. He was accustomed to being the smartest person in every room he entered. But the market had defied logic. It had behaved irrationally. And worse, Newton had behaved irrationally. He had allowed himself to be swept up in the mania. He had allowed greed and envy to override his reason. For a man who prided himself on his intellect, this was a humiliation worse than poverty. It was an intellectual defeat. He became bitter and withdrawn regarding the subject. People knew not to mention the words South Sea in his presence. If anyone spoke the name of the company, Newton would fly into a rage or sink into a deep depression. He banned the topic from his household. He tried to erase the memory of his folly. It was during this period of reflection and regret that he reportedly uttered the famous words that have become his epitaph in the financial world. He said, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." This quote is more than just a lament. It is a profound observation about the difference between the physical world and the human world. In physics, action and reaction are equal and opposite. The laws are constant. Gravity does not change its mind. It does not get excited. It does not panic. The planets do not decide to change their orbits because their friends are doing it. But in finance, the laws are made of psychology. They are driven by fear and hope and herd behavior. A stock price is not a measurement of value. It is a measurement of belief. When belief is high, the price disconnects from reality. When belief collapses, the reality returns with crushing force. Newton failed because he tried to apply the logic of the laboratory to the chaos of the coffeehouse. He assumed that because the stock was rising, there must be a reason. He forgot that sometimes the crowd runs towards the cliff simply because everyone else is running. The South Sea bubble left a permanent scar on the British economy. The Bubble Act, which had been passed to protect the South Sea monopoly, remained in force for over 100 years. It effectively banned the formation of joint stock companies until the 19th century. This slowed down the Industrial Revolution and made it harder for legitimate businesses to raise capital. It was a legislative overreaction to a specific trauma. It stifled innovation for generations because the government was so terrified of another bubble. But the legacy of the bubble is not just legal or economic. It is a warning that echoes through the centuries. The pattern of the South Sea bubble has repeated itself again and again. We saw it in the railway mania of the 1840s, where people bought shares in railways that were never built. We saw it in the Roaring Twenties before the Great Depression. We saw it in the dot-com bubble of the 1990s, when companies with no profit were valued at billions. We saw it in the crypto craze, where digital tokens with no utility were traded for fortunes. In every case, the ingredients are the same: a new technology or a new market that people don't fully understand, a promise of easy wealth that appeals to our basest instincts, a compelling story told by charismatic salesmen like John Blunt, an initial success that draws in the skeptics. And finally, the FOMO, the fear of missing out that drags in the last and smartest investors just before the crash. Newton's story tells us that intelligence is no defense against a bubble. You can have the highest IQ in the room. You can be a genius in your field. You can be the man who discovered calculus. But if you cannot control your emotions, you are just another sheep in the flock. There's a tragic postscript to Newton's life. He spent his final years comfortable, but not as wealthy as he should have been. He continued his work at the Mint, chasing counterfeiters with a zeal that some historians attribute to his anger over his own financial victimization. He became obsessed with the purity of the currency, perhaps because he had seen how easily value could be faked. He sent men to the gallows for clipping coins. He was ruthless in his pursuit of financial criminals, perhaps seeing in them the reflection of the men who had swindled him. He died in 1727, 7 years after the crash. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, a hero of science. But in the ledgers of his estate, the loss of the South Sea stock remained a gaping hole, a testament to the fact that he was human, after all. The South Sea Company itself surprisingly survived the crash. It was restructured by Walpole and continued to exist for another century, not as a trading company, but as a government debt management vehicle. It became a zombie corporation, a ghost ship, sailing on a sea of paper long after the dream of South American gold had vanished. It stood as a silent monument to the folly of 1720, dealing in tedious government annuities in a dusty office known as the South Sea House. So the next time you hear about a guaranteed investment that can't lose, the next time you see your neighbor getting rich on something you don't understand, the next time you feel that itch, that panic that you are being left behind while others get ahead, remember Sir Isaac Newton. Remember the man who could weigh the sun and the earth but could not weigh his own greed. Remember the apple that fell not from a tree but from a stock chart. And remember that while the stars move in predictable orbits, the human heart is a chaotic and dangerous thing. The universe may be rational, but the market never is. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.